Everybody, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us here at our Mapping Prejudice event. My name is Leah Sweet. I'm a resident of Tangletown. I also get to serve on the Tangletown Neighborhood Association Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, and I'm so glad I don't have to say that very often because that would make a terrible acronym. And I just wanted to go through a couple of things here at the beginning, and then we're going to turn things right over to our presenters so that we can have all of the juicy content here for everybody. First off, I'd like to say thank you to the neighborhoods who have co-sponsored this event. Tangletown, the Wedge Neighborhood, Kingfield Neighborhood Association, and I think Lowry Hill East might be the Wedge now, I'm not quite sure, but we're gonna go ahead and thank everyone just to be on the safe side. This particular event is being hosted by volunteers from our Equity and Inclusion Task Force. We were formed earlier this year in response to the murder of George Floyd. And the work of our task force is committed to advancing racial equity in our community through education, advocacy, and engagement. I'm not going to go into a lot of the work that we're doing, but I do want to share that our vision as a task force is to empower Tangletown residents to be anti-racist and to advance racial equity here in Minneapolis and beyond. A couple of logistics. We are recording this session because it will be shared more broadly with others who could not attend this evening. Please stay muted for the duration of the conversation. And if you have any questions, we definitely welcome you to submit them via the chat function. Our speaker will not be responding to those. Instead, those will be fielded by Dirk Nicholson, the chair of our task force and a board member of Tangletown Neighborhood Association, as well as Sally Bauer, our executive director. And then at the appropriate times, they'll be able to ask those questions. Couple quick updates before we turn things over to Kirsten. We have an upcoming book read here in Tangletown. It's a reading of the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson with 2 facilitated discussions by Harry Waters Jr. And that starts on January 27th. So check out the Facebook page or the Tangletown Neighborhood Association website if you want to register. Also, just to note that we as a task force are also doing some work with our friends over at the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute. And so please keep your eyes and ears out for communication that'll be forthcoming about that. So without any more logistics to cover, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our neighbor. She is a treasure in our neighborhood, and we're proud to have her this evening. Our speaker this evening is Kirsten Delegard. She is the co-founder and project director of the Mapping Prejudice project. She also happens to be a Tangletown resident, as I mentioned. She received her PhD in history from Duke University, where she trained as a women's historian. In her early research, she explored the history of women in politics. More recently, she has devoted her energy to public history and unearthing the complex past of her hometown, Minneapolis. This focus led to Mapping Prejudice and to the this is a word that I always screw up, so forgive me, Historypolis project, which Ms. Delegard also started. Now, she has a ton of really fantastic credentials and a lot of really fancy things that she has done in her body of work, and I encourage you to search that out. But I want to turn things over to Kirsten now so that she can get started and you all can be done hearing from me.
Well, I feel so lucky to be here with all of you, my neighbors. This is exactly the kind of work, kind of conversations that I hoped that we would be able to spark when we started this project. And now I'm going to have trouble again. I had this morning, so I have to restart sorry about that. Try that again. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I can't do 2 things at once. That's one of the problems. Okay. So as I was saying, this is exactly the kind of conversation that I was hoping that I could have with my neighbors when we started Mapping Prejudice, when I started Historiapolis. So I'm just so grateful to all of you for your commitment to this community, and for coming out even via Zooniverse on this winter night. So we started Mapping Prejudice in 2016, and in the time since we started this project, my colleagues and I, we've given dozens of presentations. And I would say that over time, the message that we were trying to convey to audiences became more pointed. So we would share our data about racial covenants and about housing discrimination in Minneapolis. And I really began issuing a warning when people would say, why should we care about this history? I would say that we have the highest racial disparities in the country. And of course, this is unjust, it's immoral, but it's also unsustainable, that this is going to rip our community apart. And then, of course, as you all know, on the evening of May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officers. And on this corner at 38th and Chicago. And from this corner in South Minneapolis, very close to my home, demonstrations spread first around the city, then around the country, and then around the world. So what began here in Minneapolis mushroomed into what scholars are now calling the largest protest movement in American history. Just in the month after Floyd's murder, approximately 20 million Americans took to the street in public support of Black Lives Matter. So in the wake of these events, especially in the immediate aftermath of these events, my team started fielding inquiries from people from every corner of the world who wanted to know why this started in Minneapolis. And I think that's a conversation that we're going to be having for years to come in so many different circles. But my team has been able to provide one slice of this larger explanation, the history of racial covenants. And I think even more importantly than the history of racial covenants, what I call the willful amnesia around the history of discriminatory housing practices in Minneapolis. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I want to start with some statistics because I think it's important to really confront head on, what we're talking about. The Twin Cities today has the highest gap in the country for any major metropolitan area between Black and white homeownership rates. So what does that mean? It means that 75% of white families own their own homes, and only 23% of Black families can make that same claim. Homeownership is incredibly important. This homeownership gap undergirds a whole raft of racial disparities, the other racial disparities that afflict our community. I don't think it's too hard to understand how housing sits at the foundation of everything else. It determines whether you're going to be healthy, whether you're going to be, or whether you'll be sick. It determines what kind of education you're going to have access to, and whether your family will be able to amass wealth and whether you'll be able to pass that wealth on to the next generation. So since 2016, my team at Mapping Prejudice has been presenting a question, a pretty simple question with a very complicated answer, which is, how did we get to this point? How did we get here? If Minnesota is such a great place to live, how did we get such a huge gap in such a critical area? What did we do wrong? And of course, the most important thing is, what can we do differently in the future? How do we move forward? So my team came together. It's a team that involves people with very complementary skills around the desire to show one thing to as many people as possible. That is that our contemporary racial disparities are not, they're not the result of some natural order. They're not an accident. And we've been doing this by leading community members like all of you in the construction of a map that illuminates how developers used racial covenants to reserve huge swaths of land in Hennepin County and now in Ramsey County for the exclusive use of white people. So I'll pause for our definition. Racial covenants, the topic of my project, they're clauses that are inserted into property deeds. Here in the Twin Cities, real estate developers started using racial covenants in 1910. And this is the first example of a deed of this kind that we found. It says the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. So that language, that particular language was written by one of the biggest real estate development firms at the time, by someone named Edmund Walton. And that language that you're reading, or that you can see on the screen, was inserted into thousands and thousands of deeds across the Twin Cities. The way it worked is these clauses were attached to new land that was being developed to keep people who are not white from buying or even occupying homes in those areas. The language varies. We found, I think, 200 different variations, but it was always racist. And I'm going to read you some more examples, and I just want you to be forewarned that it's disturbing. So take a deep breath, please. No persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. That language was inserted in a deed in Minnetonka in 1946. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. So this is very disturbing language, and my team, we've been very deliberate about reading it aloud at all these presentations because we want people to be perfectly clear about the intent of these covenants. We want to avoid what has been the habit in the United States, which has been to treat race with evasion and euphemism. Racism is not going to disappear if we ignore it. And part of our project is one of our motivations, one of our inspirations is to lead people in confronting this hard history. If we want justice, we have to start with truth. But it's hard to hear this, so take care of yourself when you're reading this language. So if you look at the history of housing, not just in the Twin Cities, but across the country, this question of racial covenants jumps out. They were so outrageous, they were so blatantly racist, and they were used in every community across the country. This is not just a Twin Cities thing. It's not just a big city thing. It's we found racial covenants in small towns, in rural areas. There's never been a community where people have gone looking for racial covenants where they have not found them. In fact, part of the reason for this is that by the 1930s, the federal government was actually making racial covenants, the use of racial covenants, a precondition for public underwriting of development. As soon as the federal government declared this to be best practice, then racial covenants show up everywhere. So, and racial covenants haven't been a secret. Obviously, they're in federal underwriting manuals. They've also been examined. I have dozens of books, plays, articles, investigations. They've been in movies, they've been in art, they've been in poetry. They were the subject of a whole series of legal cases, including the landmark Shelley v. Kramer that was heard before the United States Supreme Court. But even with all of that intense attention for more than a century, there's a lot that we don't know about these restrictions. So our team set out to figure out some things. What did these covenants actually say? What is the language of these covenants? Where were they used? How common were they? And how much land did they cover? I mean, these seem like really basic questions, but no one had been able to answer those questions. And we decided to do this this research in an unconventional way. We decided that we wanted to harness the power of community to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American city. So our project has been leading people with no background necessarily in research, people of all ages, all backgrounds, in the work of reading and mapping these restrictions. So my very talented colleagues have used computers to comb through the millions and millions of property records just in Hennepin County, figured out how to use computer scripts to flag the documents that seem to have this racist language. And then we turned to volunteers to verify basically what the computer had flagged. And just for Hennepin County, we had 3,000 volunteers read 177,000 historic property records. And those volunteers found 24,000 property parcels in Hennepin County with racial covenants. So here's the fruit of all of that labor. So what you're looking at here, this is a time-lapse map of the spread of racial covenants throughout Hennepin County over time. So the top right-hand corner, you can see the year, ticking along over time. The blue that you're seeing indicates where we have found a racial covenant, where we verified a racial covenant. All the blue that you see on the map, it adds up to 24,000 property parcels in Hennepin County. So no one before our project, no one has ever created a comprehensive map of this kind before for any American city. And we think that it's not only the map itself, but the way we've done the map, way we built the map in collaboration with community. We found it to be a really powerful platform for conversations like the one I hope we're going to have tonight, but also for research and for policy making. So I started out by reading you the text of these covenants to show you how you can't mistake their intent, the explicitly racist intent. This map is to show you that these were not isolated isolated examples. These were incredibly widespread. But it's also very important for you to understand how powerful these private contracts were. Covenants ran with the land, which meant that once they were attached to a parcel of land, they were there forever. It didn't matter how many times that parcel was bought or sold, what was built there. You could attach a racial covenant to a parcel that had a house, tear that house down, build an apartment. Every one of those apartments would be covered by those same racist restrictions. It didn't matter how many times the land changed hands. The covenant, when it runs with the land, it's there forever. And anyone who decided they wanted to breach a covenant, they risked losing everything all the equity that they had accumulated in that property. Breaching a covenant triggered a process that would put the land back in the hands of the person who put the covenant in the first place. That could be 40 years later. And if the person like Edmund Walton had died in the intervening time, it would go to his heirs, the land. So you can see that this is a very powerful disincentive for challenging these restrictions. But here's a painful truth about these covenants is that very few white people actually did challenge covenants. They were very popular. They were seen as necessary. Black people, by contrast, saw covenants as for what they were, as a threat to basic liberty. Here in the Twin Cities, we had leaders like Nellie Francis, Madison Jackson, Lena Olive Smith, James Wardlaw, and Katie McWatt, who devoted their lives to fighting these practices. And I always like to say their names aloud too, to make it clear that there was a very active resistance to these measures. And they weren't alone. All over the country, Black people put everything on the line to challenge these covenants. They bought houses with covenants. They moved into white neighborhoods. And that's what Arthur and Edith Lee did here in South Minneapolis in 1931. They bought a tiny white bungalow that probably many of you know in the neighborhood on the corner of 46th and Columbus. There's actually a historic marker there now that you can see. After they moved into this home with their young daughter Mary, Arthur and Edith found themselves under attack. That's the only way to describe what happened. Before they moved in, neighbors did everything they could to try to persuade them not to move in. They begged them to reconsider. They called the realtor, they called the bank, they called their city council members, they called various community members. And the Lees were really adamant that they had a right to establish their home. But as soon as they moved into the house, neighbors organized a mob. And this mob, which was thousands of people, one neighbor called it said there were 6,000 people gathered around the Lee house for most of the summer of 1931. And they weren't just milling around. They were throwing things at the house. They were throwing paint at the house. They were shooting through the windows, breaking the windows, throwing rocks through the windows. This photo on the left side here shows little Mary with her mother in front of their new house after one of these attacks. You can see the paint splattered behind them on the white clapboards. You can also see the broken window in the corner, the far right-hand corner. The house is still standing at 46th and Columbus. You can see it today because Arthur was able to draw on he was a World War I veteran, and he was able to draw on other veterans and his colleagues at the downtown downtown post office, who actually formed an armed perimeter around the house and protected the family. The family basically had to live in the basement. That was the only place they were safe from these bullets and other things that came through the windows. Mary had to have a police escort when she started kindergarten in the fall. Someone killed her dog. Arthur was arrested several times after threatening vandals. But the house, they were able to keep the house from being burned down. So the Lee house didn't have a covenant. It was right on the edge of a neighborhood that was filled with covenants. But the proliferation of these covenants normalized the ideas that led to this mob attack. According to the logic of covenants, the Lees posed a threat to the neighborhood. And as these racial boundaries hardened in American cities, this threat of white violence was ever present. This was one of the main ways that covenants were enforced. Folks didn't bother going to court. They called together a mob. So covenants are illegal today. They were made illegal. It wasn't easy to make them illegal. They were made illegal through a series of court decisions, starting with Shelley v. Kramer, and laws ending with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But just because they're illegal doesn't mean they're not important at this time today. We're still living with the legacies of these practices. So what did covenants do? They transformed a relatively mixed city into a racially segregated city. Covenants emboldened white Minneapolitans to harass their Black neighbors like the Lees. Black people were pushed into a couple of small neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And as new neighborhoods came online, sort of at the outer perimeter of the city, they were restricted through covenants. And today, those are still the whitest areas in Minneapolis. The neighborhoods where Black people could live that didn't have covenants were redlined. That was the federal practice that declared neighborhoods that were racially mixed to be hazardous investments for lenders. This choked off all the capital to these areas. So these two things, covenants combined with redlining, work to make it really hard for people who are not white to find stable, affordable, and decent housing. It made it really hard for people who are not white to buy homes. And this is important in large part because homeownership, it's important for so many reasons, but it's important because homeownership is a critical avenue to wealth accumulation. So I want to be clear at this point. I'm talking about Minneapolis. I'm using examples from Minneapolis. I'm showing you maps from Hennepin County, but this story is in no way unique to our city. So this urban reshuffling that happened, this segregation by race, this was happening in every community across the country, across the nation. Blacks, in the words of the poet Langston Hughes, were hemmed in. That's the title of a 1949 poem that he wrote about Chicago. And he included this line: "They've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the south side, can't breathe free." That line of breathing free was particularly resonant this summer for me. So 71 years later, Black people are still struggling to breathe in Minneapolis. George Floyd, some of his last words were, "Please, please, please, I can't breathe." The death of George Floyd really grows out of the structural racism that is so entrenched in our city. So when I was introduced, part of my personal biography was revealed, right? This for me, I've done a lot of more purely academic work, but my work with Mapping Prejudice, in part because it is my hometown, is in no way, a strictly academic endeavor. This work is very personal for me. I'm a third generation Minneapolitan, and at the same time that residents in South Minneapolis were terrorizing the Lees and other Black families, my grandparents, excuse me, were being welcomed to the city. So my grandparents were from immigrant families that had roots in Sweden. And I would say that they started their adult lives with no money and very little formal schooling. Two of my grandparents were orphaned at really young ages and were really on their own. None of my grandparents went beyond the 8th grade in terms of their formal education. They had a great capacity for hard work. They labored as farmhands, domestic servants, lumberjacks, carpenters. They worked in small towns all over the region: North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Montana. And then they decided to come to Minneapolis because they thought they could find opportunity here. And they were right. It's the classic immigrant story. During the Great Depression, they built businesses, they got married, they saved their money. And then in 1942, both sets of my grandparents bought houses. This was a huge watershed moment for my family. And I think you can see some indication of what a big deal it was in this film. This film was actually commissioned by my grandfather, who hired a film crew to come out and film the party that he had when my family moved into their new house that they had just purchased. And one of my uncles had this footage digitized and put up on YouTube. It goes on for hours, and it shows that they invited everyone they had ever known to come and celebrate with them. And people came in their best clothes from all over to join them for this really important moment. My dad is actually the guy in the little guy in the overalls, right in the center there. But thanks to our map, I now know that this house had a racial covenant. It was surrounded by other homes with racial covenants in an area that was blanketed by racial covenants. My mom grew up nearby. It's the same story on her block. Although both sets of my grandparents were new arrivals to the United States, they were regarded as white. And that meant that they could build their lives in this place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans who had similar incomes and education levels. So I grew up hearing stories about what it was like to be a kid in this Lake Nokomis neighborhood in the 1940s and 50s. What a wonderful place it was. My mom, my dad, all my uncles all talked about how they could spend all their time outside, how they went swimming in Lake Nokomis, they skated in the winter, they spent all their time in parks, they walked behind the falls. Minnehaha Falls, not really recommended. And one really important factor for them, the neighborhood had really solid schools. Both of my parents ended up going to college. My mother got a master's degree, even though their parents had had very limited educational opportunities. But what my family never talked about is the fact that all of this was for white people, only for white people. My parents said that it never occurred to them to question why their neighbors were all Swedish, Norwegian, and German. That this uniform whiteness just seemed utterly natural to them. And I want to say that this is at a moment when significant numbers of Black people are moving to Minneapolis from the rural South. The diversity of the city is increasing dramatically at this moment. My grandparents bought their homes just as the United States was about to see the largest expansion of the middle class in its history. And a lot of this new prosperity rested on homeownership, which had been deliberately supported by a whole raft of new federal programs in the 1930s. But these new programs, it's important to point out, these new programs introduced redlining as well as long-term mortgages and mortgage insurance. And these discriminatory policies meant that 98% of FHA loans that were made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. So these programs were made to benefit people like my grandparents. And like the GI Bill, they excluded people who were not white. So why does this matter today? Well, it matters for all kinds of reasons, but I can use my own personal story to say that 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were encouraged to buy houses in a part of the city where property values climbed for most of the 20th century. Our research shows today, more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, houses in Minneapolis, like my grandparents' house, that had covenants are now worth 15% more than the identical house that did not have a covenant. And my grandparents were able to pass this additional value, this sort of white bonus, if you want to say it, to me. When my grandfather died, my family sold his house and decided to distribute the proceeds of the house to all the grandchildren. I used my portion to put a down payment on a house in Tangletown. I was looking for the same things that my parents described as being so important to them. Easy access to the chain of lakes, good schools, right? And I'm fortunate that I had that assistance, but I'm not exceptional. In 2019, the National Association of Realtors found that 30% of first-time home buyers get help from family members to manage the purchase of a home. So like a lot of my peers, I was able to leverage the economic security of earlier generations to secure the future of my children. And I think they're reaping the benefits of this in so many ways. But since I'm a historian, my kids hear all the time about the way that their lives have been shaped by opportunities that were afforded my grandparents. I tell them, we talk all the time around the dinner table about the fact that we all carry our history with us. None of us is unencumbered. History lives with us, even if we don't acknowledge it. And we can't address the legacies of covenants today if we pretend they didn't exist or that they did not create any harm. So our the maps that we're making together are designed to help everyone confront how widespread these racist covenants were. And as we've shared it, we've discovered that it helps people to see structural racism. And when I use that phrase, structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants are classic, they're the classic manifestation of structural racism. Racism is not just a matter of personal bias, like the sentiments of people like these protesters who were protesting fair housing hearings in St. Paul in 1962. They're perfectly clear about what their sentiments are. Mapping Prejudice is trying to help people look beyond this blatant racism to see structures. We want people to see that how racist ideology has been embedded into community institutions over decades, that it's been written into our foundational documents, right? How it undergirds our community maps, and it sorts people into different trajectories. So this history, I think, is very helpful today in helping all of us understand why it seems to be the same group of people who are vulnerable to housing insecurity, and why that's significant, that housing affects, again, like I'm back to the same point, housing affects everything, every part of your life. So structural racism undergirds a system that was built deliberately, as you can see from these covenants, to keep Black and brown people from owning property. It was designed to keep them from amassing wealth. It was designed to keep Black bodies out of places that were seen as desirable. And for me, it was designed, one thing that I think about all the time is it was designed to keep Black and brown people out of the spaces that I was taught as a child belonged to all of us. So what do we do now? I think we're past time. We're past time to make amends, right? Remembering what we're doing tonight, what we're talking about this, confronting this truth is the first step towards justice. But we can't stop there. From there, we have to take action. So I always make a shameless plug for our project that we're looking for volunteers. Here's a place to start. Join one of our weekly online volunteer sessions where we help people learn how to read these deeds and transcribe the information that we need to put them on a map. We're doing Ramsey County now, and we're starting to do other communities too. We need volunteers. It's important because we're making these maps, but it's also important people talk about how the act of reading these documents changes the way they think about the world. So it's a process, and if you can read these documents and then share what you've learned with family, with friends, with elected officials, that's a really important first step. It's up to all of us, of course, to make sure that this awareness translates into action, that we avoid the mistakes of the past. And one big mistake of the past that I've been thinking about a lot since the murder of George Floyd, I'm very conscious of as a historian, is something that Jeremiah Ellison, one of our city council members, described this summer. He said, in Minneapolis, during every crisis, well-meaning white people make a ritual of acknowledging the city's deep inequities. It's as if people think that mere acknowledgement is the work. I think all of you know that the work is more than this, but sometimes it's hard to know what we need to change, right? I start in thinking about the changes that need to happen by looking at what people of color are saying they need. And one place to find that is a group called the Alliance. That's a coalition, longstanding coalition of housing and growth organizations that are led by people of color. They've created a policy agenda that you can go and look at online. And you don't have to agree with everything, but it offers some ideas of places to start in terms of the policies that we should be supporting. I think one thing that we have to just be realistic about is that these solutions will cost money, that we need to make overdue investments in housing, in schools, in neighborhoods, in people. But I think we all know what the alternatives might be, right? We've all seen that this summer. And I think it's also important as we're thinking about this to remember that reparations, this reparative work, is not just about money. It's not just about throwing more money at a problem. Reparations is also a moral charge. It's a charge. It's a transformation that we all need to grapple with. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about reparations, and he calls it the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. He says it's more than recompense for past injustices. Reparations, in the words of Coates, is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. And I, for one, am ready to be a part of this renewal. And I'm grateful to all of you for showing up tonight, because you remind me that I am not alone in that desire. So with that, I would like to open up the floor and start discussing.
Sure. Thank you, Kirsten. I will say, having seen the presentation previously, it's no less powerful or shocking the second and third time around. I mean, I can't imagine having to give it over and over, but it's really is powerful. It looks like we've kind of, I'm gonna try to get to most of these. Some of them have some, some overlap, but it does seem like there is some interest that is sort of the practical thing of, my own house. How do we see if we have covenants that are attached to our own property? And can people change their deeds to remove the language? What is that legal process like? That kind of a thing.
So I shared, and I think it went out with when you registered, I shared a couple of documents that will answer some of those questions, but I can just do sort of an overview of what that's like. Some answers to some of those questions. One, so you can find a lot more information about all this at our website, www.mappingprejudice.org. So I see also in the chat that people are asking about high res version of the map. So when you go to our website, the map is the centerpiece, and there's two there's two tabs that you can click on with the map. One shows the time-lapse map that you've seen tonight. If you click on the Explore tab, you can zoom in on any property parcel in Hennepin County, and you can see whether or not there was a covenant on it, what the language of the covenant is. You can, and it also has an address search function, so you can search for any address too. It really is a rabbit hole that you can get yourself, get lost down pretty easily. I mean, it's the map is endlessly fascinating to see where these covenants showed up and what the patterns are. So that's the first place. If you want to know whether you have a covenant on your house, that's the first place to start. I can give you some sort of general, I think, guidance about that. If the land on which your house was built was platted before 1910, you're not going to find a covenant. So these were not put in place retroactively. So, for instance, Kenwood, there's no covenants in Kenwood, even though you would think in some ways that was a very desirable neighborhood where people would be perhaps eager to make sure it was all white. It's not because people in Kenwood didn't think that they needed racial covenants. It's that it was just developed too early. Same thing for neighborhoods in further out in Hennepin County that were developed after 1955 or after 1968. They also don't have covenants. So you'll find covenants in those neighborhoods that were platted in those years between 1910 and about 1955. So if you find a covenant on your property, the legislature has passed a law in 2019 that makes it much simpler to do what's called discharging the covenant. This doesn't erase any evidence that there was a covenant on your property, but it allows you a remedy for this moral injury that people feel, justifiably, to find out that they have these kind of racist clauses embedded in their attached to their property. It's a way of filing a sort of a renunciation of the covenant, after the fact. And one of the documents that I shared with the facilitators tonight, and I think they're going to send it out at the end, gives you a step-by-step process of like how you do that and how you can get help to do that. So it was like, so what were remind me, I can keep.
I think that more or less kind of hit some of the, if at my house, then what kind of thing. I mean, just
right.
Sure.
Yeah, and people see these patterns and they wonder why are the covenants on one side of the street, not on the other side of the street? And it has to do with when things, covenants were almost always put in by the developer when the area was platted. They were
that was a question that had come up, which is that, as you see the map kind of grow, some areas were definitely, the swaths were larger, or it was entire blocks. And so I think that was a clarification that people were looking for. That sort of answers to this, when the neighborhood or the block or the area was developed in the context of the early part of the last century. And then another clarification that I think this will be pretty simple. So the covenant is attached to the house or the property, and the red line is the geographic area. It's sort of the difference between the covenant and the redlining, I guess, is what.
Yeah. Yeah, so covenants they're legal clauses that are inserted into the deed. They're part of a private contract. Redlining, the redlining maps were, they were just visual representations of where parts of town and neighborhoods that banks decided were good or bad investments. So after the 1930s, the federal government, or during the 1930s, the federal government divided cities up into four risk areas. The best area was, they were labeled green, great, highest, easiest, safest investment area. Next was blue, which was, good, solid, good. Yellow, which was declining, and red, which was hazardous. Any neighborhood that had any kind of racial mixture in it was immediately designated red. So any place that people who are not white were living was red. It was a hazardous area that, it was not recommended for banks to issue loans. It was very hard to get federally subsidized loans in those areas, which is why you don't have federally backed mortgages in those redlined areas, that people pay higher interest rates to live in those areas. To get that highest rating, that green rating, you had to have racial covenants in place. So when we first started getting the data about where the racial covenants were, we overlaid it on the federal redlining maps from the 1930s, and it followed perfectly. So you see the racial covenants just completely populating all the green areas, and of course they're not in the red areas. So that's the connection between the two, that the covenants lay the groundwork. They segregate the city, they kind of sort people into these different neighborhoods, and then this rating system can come along later and impose value on those different neighborhoods that have real material consequences for people.
Sure. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but then I think some of those areas that were redlined, then later as cities grew, were more likely to be, eminent domain taken over, taken out for highways, this and the other. So even what was there was, I guess.
Yeah. So I mean, we have other maps that shows the freeway system was, you can see it follows perfectly through the the redlined neighborhoods. The one layers on another. First you have the racial covenants, then you have the redlining, then you have the freeway system. It's a cascading set of harms, basically.
Absolutely. And then I think this one, somebody was wondering, so can covenants, even if they exist, still be enforced?
No. So there are covenants. There's still covenants out there, but they're usually used for things like, you can't have a vegetable garden in your front yard, or every house in this development has to be beige, or that's covenant. Real estate covenants are still used. They're not allowed to have these racial prescriptions in them anymore. But one of our concerns when we started Mapping Prejudice in 2016 was the fragility of the ban on these kind of on the ban against racial covenants, that we could foresee a moment especially in 2016, where Congress could decide to repeal the Fair Housing Act, and then covenants would be legal again. They would be enforceable. And because they run with the land, they're there forever. You know, they never go away. So I think this is another example of we have to be constantly vigilant and assume that any gains that we've made, that we could lose them at any moment. So no, they're not enforceable today. They're not legal today. But you know, I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, but you know, we always have to be vigilant about that things could change.
Sure. This is an interesting one too. I think, as you mentioned, that this was not exclusive to Minneapolis by any stretch. This was something that was going on across the country. So, if it is the case that this redlining and covenants that were restrictive based on race, why is it that Minneapolis racial equality seems so much worse? You know, the statistics today. You know, why is it persistent here, or why is that effect different here?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. And some of it is that we don't have comparative data to, you know, we haven't been able to map covenants in other areas. But our working hypothesis is this, that it has to do with the intersection of the introduction of racial covenants with the growth of the Black population in the Twin Cities, that the Black population in Minneapolis and St. Paul was tiny, you know, really until the 1950s. So when covenants were introduced at a moment in the development of the city that basically locked people of color out of homeownership in a very dramatic and effective way. And what we know about homeownership and control of land is that that especially people of color tend to expand their control of land and homeownership through mutual aid networks. So by sort of closing down any kind of land access to that community, there's cascading effects, right? And basically, by the time that most Black residents came to Minneapolis and St. Paul, there were no neighborhoods that were open to them. Like the housing shortage was so acute. It was so hard. The barriers were so high at that point. And in that sense, Minneapolis is and St. Paul are a little different from other cities that had large established Black communities before covenants were introduced. Those were beach holes. Those were, you know, places where, you know, it's very hard to introduce covenants retroactively. And once people, you know, own that land, they could hold on to it a lot more easily than, you know, doing like my grandparents did, which is coming to a new city and, you know, becoming homeowners, becoming owning land. So I think it has to do with the timing and, you know, of the way Minneapolis developed. But that's our working hypothesis right now.
And then I guess, because like you said, because it would be a comparative thing over cities, do you see that this project kind of looping that in, and does it grow in that direction? Is that the thrust of this?
That's what we actually received a large federal grant this summer to expand, to empower other communities to do the same kind of work. So we're working on creating a sort of a national database of these racial covenants in communities across the country, and we're working with different community groups to sort of coach them to do the same kind of work that we're doing with Mapping Prejudice, in the hopes that we can then, you know, get their data and compare with the data that we have assembled here in Minneapolis. And I think this is the I love, you know, obviously I'm a very committed Minneapolitan, you know, third gen, and my work is here, and I love the history of this city. I think it's so important. But I also think that we need to have, you know, a national conversation about this.
I've got some intersection kind of questions. So we've got a couple of questions here that are looking about, or I think that are trying to get to sort of the intersection of this question of housing, be it redlining or racial covenants, and if you have any insights about how that interacts with, say, violent policing in the city, or disparities in education and the way school districts are drawn, or where children are funneled based on, their geography within the city.
Yeah, those are big questions, right? And the really important questions. I don't mean to be, I'm not saying that in a,
Sure.
So, I mean, I think it's important to, just get back to the basic facts that a lot of these disparate treatments that people experience would not be possible if they were not sorted into different neighborhoods by race. Like if people are all mixed up in terms of where they're living, it's very hard to then do something like run a highway through a neighborhood and overwhelmingly displace just Black people, right? Or it's very, if your city is really integrated, the evidence is clear that actually police fatalities, police brutality is much higher in cities with segregation, that have more extreme segregation like Minneapolis does. So just the fact of the separation of different races is a precursor for all these other disparate treatments. That said, we also have some anecdotal evidence that especially in the 1950s, the Minneapolis school board or Minneapolis school system kept changing the boundaries of school attendance based on race. So a deliberate attempt to, the opposite of integration. And I think it's really important to remember a piece of Minneapolis history in terms of schools, that Minneapolis as a city was under a federal court order in 1972 to integrate its schools. That, we like to, again, think of ourselves as a very progressive metropolis, but there was a lot of resistance to actually addressing these, these issues at different times. But a lot of it, we call racial covenants in some ways like the origin story for a lot of these disparities in Minneapolis. Very early on, we shared a very preliminary version of our map with a data team at City Hall downtown. And this GIS data person looked at our map and she said, yep, it's all the same map. It doesn't matter what you're looking at in Minneapolis, whether you're looking at maternal mortality rates or poverty rates or COVID rates now, or this is the one that it never occurred to me, tree cover in Minneapolis. That tree cover really follows the covenants too. Like no matter what sort of indicator of well-being you can pull on, it all correlates to the original covenants map. Like where are their covenants? Covenants served as a magnet for investments of all kinds, whether it's parks, tree cover, street maintenance, school construction, all of these things that really shape a neighborhood in different ways. And we're still, and obviously we're living with the consequences of those.
I think we still have one of the most, functionally segregated school systems in the country as well,
Yeah.
So yeah, lasting effects for sure. There are a couple of questions that I think people were wondering, obviously from the examples that you had read from some of these deeds. A couple of people noted that it seems that Native Americans weren't included, or I guess in this case, I'm not sure if it's excluded or included. But has that come forward? Do you think that there is a reason why that might have been the case?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is that some of it is important. It's important to understand what people meant by these early 20th century racial terminology. So if you read about like sort of the intellectual history of racial thinking in this period, the thinking was that Native Americans were part of, the subset of humans that were known as Mongolians. So it doesn't say Native Americans, but it does say Mongolians. So, for if people at the time knew what that meant. And, so that's one thing. Another thing to keep in mind is the fact that I always refer to the law that was passed by the state legislature in the aftermath of the U.S. Dakota War that barred Dakota people from living in Minnesota was like a giant racial covenant. So you didn't need laws banning Dakota people from living in neighborhoods in Minneapolis when you had a state law that banned Dakota people from living anywhere in the state. So that's one thing. I mean, in part, the lack of direct, reference to Native people is a sign of their the way they were invisible in the eyes of many white people, even though they were there. So those are two of the reasons. And then, the language of racial covenants really evolved over time to be much more like only people of the so-called white race, only people of the so-called Caucasian race. And that was a catch-all term that was like, you know it when you see it. So if people perceived you to be white, then you were white. If they perceived you not to be white, and we have heard stories again from people, of course, most Native Americans, like most Americans, are racially mixed. So what a lot of Native people have told me is that their parents, their grandparents always told them, don't ever tell anyone that you're Indian. And if they ask, say you're French, like that. Because we are French, because our family's French too, right? So, so it's this, can people pass as white in certain situations?
So I think maybe and again, I think some of the material that we'll send out or maybe that you had passed along to us may address some of this, but I think to the point of reparations and what people can do, we have this information and now what? So do you know of, or is there an example that you can think of where a community has been successful in making reparations for this, this historic injustice that, has this fallout that follows, this trail of injustice that follows?
I would love, if someone has an example that I'm just not thinking of, I would love to know. So if there's some example of a community that's been really successful, I am frankly very heartened by the fact that the conversation is starting around reparations. I mean, I'm not saying that's enough, but we have felt like our mandate, with one of our mandates with Mapping Prejudice is that we're making a case for reparations, and that it's really not up to us as, especially as white people who have benefited from the system, to say what those reparations would look like. But that it is up to us to get people to come to the table to agree that that crimes have been committed or harms have been, perpetuated, and that it's our collective responsibility to address those harms. So, I think that what those could look like could be, I can think of a myriad of different possibilities, whether it's in the form of a sort of a GI Bill type, education/housing, huge, federal program of some kind. But I think it's really up to the communities that have been most affected to say what they need, to address the harms. I mean, that's in any kind of mediation, for a sort of a restitution situation in our court system today. That's, you always start with the victim saying what they need to recover from the harms. So I think I'm just offering that as a process going forward. I haven't heard of, I think there's examples of reparations in our nation's history, like the reparations that the federal government paid to Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. I mean, it's not an unprecedented idea that federal policies that harmed people, especially, should be remedied in some material way for people. So that, there's a what's the word? This has been done before. So is the word that what I'm trying to convey. Yeah, but I would love to hear if any of you can offer up examples of communities that you know of where this conversation has happened and that you've seen, positive outcomes. I think the conversation is happening everywhere, and it's going to be happening everywhere on the local, state, and hopefully federal level.
Well, not exactly an example of a community, but it does look like we had somebody post a comment, I think Jeremy Kalin, it looks like, who said that he and a colleague are working on a model of pledging reparations attached to the sale of the home. So, I mean, that's an interesting proposition, if it's community-based, something that people might be able to do individually as this models like that might develop. Here's a question from one of the attendees. How can a neighborhood group best combat this type of segregation in their own neighborhood? I believe Mapping Prejudice exhibit at the Hennepin History Museum discussed neighborhood organizations' role in upholding racial covenants. Since this is organized by neighborhood organizations, could you talk about that role? Possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all need to, so in conversations, especially with local policymakers, one thing that I have heard again and again is that if 7 people show up for a public meeting on something, that's huge, and if we think, and if we think about all the times, perhaps like in our own neighborhood, there's been, a proposal for an affordable housing development. Did you show up? And what side were you on? I think that's a place to start in terms of advocating, welcoming. And I think also, but we have to not just work on our neighborhood level, because the reality is that these neighborhoods, the Kingfield, Tangletown, and the Wedge, they're expensive. Right. And it's going to be, a new affordable housing, it's going to be relative, and they're also very developed. It's relatively harder for a new affordable housing to come into our neighborhood. So what are we doing on the state level to make sure that there's more funds, to support affordable housing? I mean, we have a massive shortfall in terms of our funding, our collective funding of affordable housing. And, without that kind of infrastructure investment, we're not going to be having any discussions in our neighborhoods about affordable housing. So, those are 2 things that I would offer. I mean, I think it's also just, we have to reframe the way we're thinking about housing, that we have to be thinking about it as a basic right for people, and with the understanding that if we don't do that, we have all these other cascading problems that fall from people not having stable, affordable, decent housing that keeps them embedded in community, that gives them stability, that doesn't make them sick, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, I just think, we can't just be thinking about our housing as investments, for ourselves or, for other people or, so.
And I think that might actually go to another question that was related to this, which is, what people can do to, I guess, if it's not reparations, but kind of atoning for this past, and what can we do as individuals or community members to sort of maybe small steps, personal level things that we can do that might make a difference. And I think maybe one of the things that you just mentioned, which is being aware of projects that are coming up and going to meetings and standing on the side of it that might be in favor of affordable housing and different kinds of developments in our neighborhoods, because it is something it's come up before in our neighborhood with new developments that are coming in. It's just expensive.
Yeah,
development.
and I think people feel like, oh my gosh, like I would love to support affordable housing. I can give a certain donation to Beacon, the Beacon Housing or Habitat for Humanity, and all of that is good. But we all, as individuals, have very limited resources, right? I mean, relatively limited. But what I think is more important is for us to support larger public policy initiatives that really put the resources into the housing that's necessary. So there's been several huge bonding bills at the state for housing that have not passed. These are the things that we should all be supporting. That's ultimately going to be how we really create the kind of housing that will really meet the needs of everyone in our community. I think a collective public, option.
Then I think maybe kind of to that point too, and kind of diversity of housing and all of that. Somebody is wondering if you might be able to speak to the 2040 plan and how you see that impacting housing disparities.
So yeah, the 2040 plan, it was very interesting in the way Mapping Prejudice and the 2040 plan sort of developed in tandem and ended up being intertwined in many ways, in part because the city knew when they started this long-term planning process, they knew that housing was really, that they wanted to make, they needed to make changes to land use policy in order to advance racial equity. But they didn't really understand how those land use policies really contributed to the disparities that we see today. And our data helped sort of fill in some of that history for policymakers. And our data actually ended up being used extensively in the 2040 report. So I think it's, I see the 2040 plan as, in terms of changing, one piece of history that's important to understand is that Minneapolis did not have single family zoning, the widespread single family zoning, until the same year that covenants were made illegal. So basically, if you put the pieces together, what happened is that zoning, the very strict zoning law or regulations that went into effect in the 1950s basically locked into place the development patterns that were created by covenants. It became very hard to then introduce more affordable housing, varieties into neighborhoods that had been zoned for the single family housing. And that was really a departure from the earlier period in the city when you had a lot of more diverse kinds of housing, duplexes, fourplexes, et cetera, in different, and certainly in all of our neighborhoods, in the Kingfield neighborhood and Tangletown neighborhood, in the Wedge. So in some ways, with the 2040 plan, by allowing greater density, is peeling back that layer, that zoning layer that was put into place basically to lock the city into that place that it was at right when, after covenants had been in place for decades. So in some ways, it's an important first step in terms of introducing more options for people in terms of developing affordable housing. But I think in no way can you see the 2040 plan or density as a silver bullet. Like that's not gonna be the answer. I mean, the reality is that we still have to pursue all these other policies to make sure that we have greater racial equity in our access to housing, that to encourage home ownership, and that the market alone is not going to take care of our housing equity problem. So I think sometimes when people think about zoning, like, it's good that there's more flexibility in terms of the kinds of housing forms that we can have in our established neighborhoods, but we have to remember that it's just a first step.
We had a question that was wondering about engaging residents at earlier ages. Has there been any effort or interest, or do you see maybe going to high school students or something like this continue to drive the message home, or reach an audience.
We have wonderful teachers who are using this material all the time. So wonderful teachers in Minneapolis. The head of social studies education, Lisa Purcell, is in our neighborhood. Her kids are at Washburn. She is absolutely fantastic in terms of the way she is using the resources that we have been creating through Mapping Prejudice, especially in this Zoom remote environment, to introduce this history and these issues to high school students in particular, and even some. We've gotten a lot of inquiries from middle school teachers too. So we actually, when we made the pivot to the remote world at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the things my team did is we created an educator's guide, because we wanted to put more resources in the hands of teachers who were suddenly teaching in this remote environment. And actually, we were perfectly set up with our maps and our online Zooniverse work to engage with students remotely. And so we have had tremendous buy-in from teachers and students, and at all ages. So that's been one of the most satisfying things, I would say, about this work. We've also had this fantastic vehicle, Jim Crow of the North, this TPT documentary that my friend and our neighbor Dan Bergen created and produced, telling the stories that we have unearthed in the archive and telling the story of our project. And that has been that's now being used by thousands of classrooms across the state and now across the nation. So we're just incredibly fortunate to have a partner like Dan and TPT, who made this very accessible, beautiful, documentary about this history. So, and I remember one presentation that we went to where there was a young man there, and he stood up at the end and he said, "What I don't understand is why this is not being taught in every class in the country." And I've never felt more gratified and flattered than from that comment. So.
It is, like I said, it's a very powerful thing, and so it's wonderful to reach people in a variety of ways, and all across ages and all of that. I think is really important.
And I should say that my kids are mortified, that I keep showing up in their classes, and they're like, "We don't know her." That it's like the worst thing as a teenager to have your mom, show up in your classroom on the screen. So.
Some things. Yeah. A couple of, I guess, fairly specific ones. Somebody was wondering, how strongly do anti-Semitic covenants correlate with ones that are, were very clearly, racial or country of origin driven?
So the question of how did covenants target Jews is a really important question. And one of the first ways I learned about covenants is through people in the Jewish community. They're very, very strong oral storytelling around covenants and how they affected housing choices for Jews. So when we started getting the data back and started seeing what the text of the covenant said, we were really surprised to see how few of these covenants mention Jews explicitly. And so that led to more questions, because we had always been told that they targeted Jews and Blacks and specifically. And so when I started digging back through the archive, I found that Edmund Walton, who was the man who brought covenants to Minneapolis, the Edmund Boulevard is named for him, I just want to say, near the river. He published an ad in the Minneapolis Tribune in 1919 that advertised his new development that he was putting in near Lake of the Isles, and he included the text of the covenant that was attached to the development, sort of as a selling point for people, and it named Jews in the covenant. And the Jewish community saw that ad and organized in response, and actually went to the state legislature and got a law passed to make it illegal to discriminate against Jews in real estate people based on religion in real estate transactions. So from that point forward, you see explicit mentions of Jews fall out of the covenant language. It doesn't mean that covenants were not used to discriminate against Jews, because the question is then who's white and who's not, who's of the Caucasian race and who's not, right? And so that's where but it leads to different outcomes, the way people interpreted that. So it seems that it was interpreted in a certain way in Edina, where there's the suburb is almost entirely covered with covenants. They were used really to target Jews there. In St. Louis Park, they were used differently. It seemed like they were not interpreted to include Jews, and you have a lot of Jews buying houses with racial covenants. You have synagogues being located actually on parcels that have racial covenants. You have Jewish developers in St. Louis Park using covenants. And so it's a very different history depending on the interpretation. And it's a history that matters. I mean, whether or not you could buy property, own land, really made a difference for families. So this has been a really significant thing I've had lots of conversations in the Jewish community specifically around this, with the starting point of it's more complicated than people thought. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. At no point are we saying there was not anti-Semitism in housing in Minneapolis. I mean, Minneapolis was an extremely anti-Semitic place, but it seems like the area of housing was a little more complicated than people thought.
Sure. Are you aware of these types of covenants and practices being used in other countries?
Yes, in fact. So Canada is the place. Apparently they were used all over Canada. We've heard from people and researchers in Canada. So actually one of our colleagues, she was a grad student at the U, has just taken a job in Toronto, and she is, one of the things she wants to do is map racial covenants all over Canada. So that's the only, beyond that, I don't know. We haven't heard from other places.
And then I know that this will be noted on the website and probably in the materials that you're providing, but are there any, if people are wanting to get involved and help you do the work of going through the deeds and identifying covenants and all of that, can you maybe tell us a little bit about how specifically people might get involved?
Yeah, so you can go to, if you go to our website, there's some tabs at the top, and one of them is the Get Involved tab. If you click on that, it will lead you to the schedule for our volunteer sessions. Right now we have weekly online, Zoom volunteer sessions. And what happens in those sessions is that it provides a place for people to gather and go through, learn how to transcribe the deeds, and also have conversations about what they're finding, share this experience of reading these documents, and and figure out what their reaction is going to be, to what their action point is beyond reading the deeds. So we have weekly sessions. We alternate between afternoon and evening sessions to try to make them as accessible. So that's the easiest way to get, to start out with the project. But we've also created a lot of other resources. If for whatever reason you can't make those times, we've created an online training video and other guides. We have my colleague Penny Peterson is fantastic about answering questions that you can put in through the talk board on Zooniverse. So we have lots of resources. You don't have to figure it all out on your own, depending on whether you want to do it with other people online or sort of at your own pace using our training videos. So, but it's all in the website, www.mappingprejudice.org, and go to the Get Involved section.
Thank you. I think it seems like we may have gone through most of the questions and all of that. So I guess I want to thank you, Kirsten. This was really powerful and impactful, and we appreciate you coming to us. And I appreciate so many people on this call. I think this may be the biggest one we've ever hosted.
Wow. Well, I'm grateful to all of you for your commitment. I mean, as I said, I feel honored to have you all as neighbors and to be in a place where people want to engage around this issue. So thanks to all of you. You give me hope for the future.
Hope is good.
Hope is good. We're going to stick with hope right now. So yeah, and just get in touch if we can help with anything else. It's not just me. I have other fabulous colleagues, and I hope that we can answer your questions and support the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks
Good
everybody.
night.
Have a nice
Thank you.
evening.